another edition of the Lean Newsroom. Brown.
Groves.
That's how we have to begin every episode.
That's true.
But, yeah.
Brown and Groves.
So this week we're going to be talking about big changes in the newspaper business. We were talking about Gannett, like many other newspaper companies, decided to spin off its newspaper operations, its newspaper division, into a separate company, which is kind of exciting and nerve-wracking and all the things that come with spinning off, including hopefully improved financial performance, which the markets always love. And also, in the past week, Gannett, some job descriptions for Gannett's Newsroom of the Future was leaked to Jim Romanesco. So we're going to be looking over those. So what do you want to talk about first, Brown?
Well, let's just talk about those job descriptions. That sounded kind of interesting. And what's your thoughts on those and some of your friends that are working at Gannett? I'm sure they have maybe some perspectives on that too.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you the first thing, when we always think about culture, I want to highlight something that's in this, is that longtime Gannetoids will view this first notion a little nervously, that it's called Picasso, which is kind of, I don't want to say funny, but years ago they had actually a pretty interesting idea. The motivation was good for it, which basically you would have design and reporters and editors, everybody working together on particular stories, and the initiative was called Maestro. You would maestro a story, and it was before I came to Gannett, but when I went to Gannett, it was still sort of in the Gannett lore about Maestro and how that this had been this top-down initiative that had come down, and every newsroom was going to do this, and it had. Even though it had good ideas and there were pluses to doing it, there was that resistance because it was the top-down idea. And so when I saw the Picasso, I was like, oh no, the long-timers are going to be saying, oh no, it's another Maestro. And it's that top-down idea, even though I think when you start looking at some of the titles, and I like the idea of spinning job descriptions towards digital. I think that's a smart idea. It's just that Gannett tends to change things. It's good that they're always changing things and trying new things, but the thing that's a little bit that I wonder from a cultural standpoint is people are always changing.
Right.
And I wonder if they just view this as, oh, if we can just survive this, this too shall pass.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the exact same reaction I had, because, I mean, on the one hand, some of these kind of sound like the types of jobs that in my new job as director of the news social journalism program at CUNY, that we're trying to prepare students for. I mean, there's a focus there on engagement. There's a focus on actually understanding what the audience needs. They talk the words community, engagement. I mean, it's a little bit hard to tell with what they have here, but this isn't really sort of the purely traditional, beat reporting that you otherwise see. But, like on the other hand, it's also kind of hard to tell, like, are these just words that, that they just kind of picked up as being buzzwords and they're very serious about, changing the culture, creating reward systems that actually make this happen, or is this just more... and I think, I mean, having worked for Gannett, you know more about them than I do, but they do kind of have that history of, making a lot of these changes, but, maybe not doing all the things that you need to do to actually effectively change the culture. So it was just kind of hard for me to tell with this, exactly where they were going with this. But there definitely are some encouraging signs in there that they're being innovative and they're experimenting and they're trying to really get, that whole understanding what your community actually wants piece much more to the forefront of, the journalism that they're doing, rather than, we'll tell you exactly what you need to know type of thing.
Well, and the thing that I think is interesting when I look at these job titles is it seems transitional. It's not necessarily completely transformational. And the reason I say that is if you go down lower and you look at some of the positions, the reporter position is pretty traditional. Researchers, reports, and writes compelling journalism that continuously grows a fan base by informing and engaging. That sounds like something you would have done for the print edition.
Yeah, that's true.
It doesn't sound that much different, and you still have those kinds of positions for breaking news. Now, this is interesting. Look at some of the titles of the beats. Patriotism. That's kind of an interesting idea for a beat. And then, crime and justice is pretty typical. Lots on sports. Lots on sports and breaking news and youth. It seems like they might be missing some of the other categories of news. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out from a community perspective. But when you go back up, I do like this idea in the job description on the community content editor, which given the pay scale, I'm kind of looking at this. These two positions, the content editor and the content coach, I almost wonder if those would be the equivalent to top level editors in the newsroom. So like a managing editor or a city editor, that's going to be the equivalent of what we're looking at here given those pay ranges. But I thought this was really interesting. That here you have it analyzes audience needs and procures complementary community content for all platforms such as stories, posts, blah, 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 blah. What I think is interesting flips it to looking at the audience, which is something that we've always talked about as being important. But this procuring, if I can pronounce it, procuring complementary community content. To me, that says like citizen journalism, or outside or contributors. So I thought that, and it even mentioned seeks partners, services, and contributors to deepen products' reach and impact, which I thought is interesting. But
yeah, definitely.
But something I think is also worth commenting on is I noticed, like you have always talked about now with your new role, one of the ideas that Jeff Jarvis is talking about is thinking of journalism as a service instead of a product. And it doesn't seem like they're moving in the service realm. They're still thinking of it in a product realm.
Yeah, overall, that's what I was kind of, I was kind of struggling with this. On the one hand, they're moving a little bit more toward the service side of things, like compared to, the completely traditional job descriptions, because they are, that whole analyzing audience needs and talking about engagement, that's a little bit more toward that side. But then at the same time, there is more of that traditional stuff here. So that's what, that's why I was kind of struggling. I'm like, several of these do sound like they'd be a good fit for the kinds of students we'll be producing in the new degree. But then on the other hand, I'm not really sure just from reading. And I guess these are fairly short descriptions. I didn't click and read through the whole full description on all of them, so I don't know.
Yeah, I pulled up one of them. So here's one for the community content editor. And they're fairly detailed, but if you look at them, so, edits and oversees the editing of contributed content, strategizes with reporters and newsroom leaders to identify contributors. So this is almost like a community organizer.
Yeah,
that community.
That's much more along the lines of, journalism as service. So,
and look at that 6th bullet point. Provides great customer service, helping readers find answers and solutions. That's pretty interesting.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I don't know. It's interesting. And the beats that they came up with, like you were saying, the patriotism and youth. That's really interesting too. I've been thinking about writing a blog post about, I recently joined Nextdoor, the social network for people in your neighborhood, and what's really been interesting to me is just, and some of this is because maybe I'm an outlier. I'm a northerner that is currently living in the South. But, I just have kind of realized from that just how little in common I have with the vast majority of people who are in the closest geographical proximity to me. Certainly we have, shared interests that, that I could use news and information on, but I mean, it really speaks to how, if you're really going to serve your readers in today's day and age, you also have to find those other niches that people are very passionate about,
Mm-hmm.
and find ways to deliver news and information for those too. I really think there's a balance there, because historically I think we always thought about it as like hyper-local was always, the stuff that's really important to you because you live on this block or, this specific little neighborhood. And I think there still is a place for that, but I think these news organizations are doing the right thing by trying to identify some of the other interest areas that people are really passionate about that don't necessarily correspond to like all the typical newspaper sections, like the food
and I think that's important to note on this list, that this particular list that was leaked to Romanesco was it's from the Pensacola News Journal, so it's not from all of the Gannett. I mean, the way that it was portrayed was that they're rolling this out to all the organizations, but so when we see those beats, I don't know that every Gannett paper is going to have a patriotism beat. That's what they've decided to do in Pensacola, because that seems
right,
to fit.
yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense if they execute it that way. My only concern when I look at this kind of thing is that because it is top down and they're rolling it out and they're saying, okay, here's what we're going to do, and everybody has to reapply for their job. So you're adding that layer of anxiety in an already anxious environment. In addition to the fact that you just spun off your newspaper operation, so you don't have that cushion of the broadcast. That one, 60% of Gannett's profits come from the television, comes from its broadcast. Right. Even though they get a chunk of their revenue from the newspapers, the profitable arm is the broadcast. So once you remove that from the picture, does that lead to the demise of print or a severe diminishment of what they've had in print because they don't have that support from broadcast? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But what I thought was also instructive was looking at the comments, because what you see here is you see some of the resistance among some of the people in the comments saying, automatically ready to jump. I thought this was it. Things began sliding downhill when they started calling us content providers. I don't know that I take issue with content providers. I think that's an acknowledgement that, if you're going to be blending in stuff from the public along with the professional journalists, it's all content. Let's not privilege what the journalists are producing, even though we might want to. But I thought this was interesting too, was this comment from this guy from Pittsburgh. 20 years late, but Gannett seems to be wising up. But as I've said before, give 10 reporters under 30 an iPhone, a laptop, a geographic territory, and no desk, and tell them to hit the road and blog, photograph, and video whatever they see, or find a value or interest in their news turf. I think that's interesting, but that still looks at it from the outsider-in approach of sort of saying, you go find news, you know it when you see it, instead of sort of making it a collaboration of what's important to the community.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Kind of. I found it really interesting to watch what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri, with all the riots and that. Social media has been really just pretty cool, a pretty cool way to witness that story.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I found it really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to see just kind of how Gannett, is communicating about the new positions and its overall change in direction, because I think that makes a big difference, and I think Ken Doctor has said that a little bit in writing about the shift, too, that, this is, I mean, even if they did it for purely financial reasons and, shareholder pressure, it's still an opportunity for these leaders to sort of say, okay, now we have an excuse to really take things in a new direction and kind of change the way we sort of formulate our goals and our mission. And I'm kind of wondering, it's a really interesting time, and I'm kind of wondering exactly exactly how they're handling that, because I think that's going to make a big difference. Like, it's not just what the job descriptions are, it's like how you talk about that with the staff, how you make sure that people are on board. There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that I'm not sure yet how it's all playing out, but will be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, the friends that I've talked to, they're people who've worked at the paper for a while, and so they've been through a number of Gannett initiatives. So that the way they approach it is, as they've done past corporate initiatives, it's like, okay, we'll give it a try and we'll see what happens, but we're not sure how long it'll be around before they decide to go on to the next thing. Because I remember, I forget the exact title of it, but I remember about 4 or 5, maybe even longer ago, Gannett came up with this idea of community content desks, I think is what they called them. And basically it was kind of moving in this direction, but it's saying, let's be more sensitive to what the community wants and what they're going after. And again,
I remember that. Like, what really happened with those? I mean, was that like successful? Was it?
It was a thing, it was adopted. Newsrooms did it, and they kind of went along with it. And then if the needle didn't move, or if it didn't move enough, then the next initiative came down the pike. And so I think that's why I think they may have some challenges, because as I said, especially for those longtime people that have thought of, remember the Maestro initiatives, or even, I mean, that's, like I said, I'm speaking from one newsroom's perspective, but I just thought it was interesting that for some of the long-timers, they saw that Maestro was almost part of the mythology. It was like, oh yeah, I remember Maestro. Don't say that word, because it was just it was a bad experience, and so.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing, because I mean, on the one hand, I think our book will partly be about how can you get used to this idea that if you're really a constantly learning organization, you are going to have to like go through a number of different experiments. But
right.
But at the same time, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical when every couple of years there's like a new thing, and if your organization has historically done a really bad job sort of managing newsroom change, that legacy is going to stick with you, and it's going to be even more challenging for you to kind of chart a new course, because I mean, that memory gets very ingrained and makes those defensive routines like more likely to pop out, I guess.
Well, and when I first went and worked for Gannett in 1997, one of the strengths I thought of the company was that there was local autonomy. There was abilities to make local decisions. There were corporate edicts and things we had to do because of corporate, but we could make decisions about our market in terms of coverage, in terms of how we set up our newsroom, and kinds of, I mean, there was a surprising amount of freedom, more so than I thought, because I worked for a family-owned newspaper before Gannett, and you always heard all the horror stories, and people were like, oh, you don't want to work for Gannett, and my experience was it was not the horror story that everybody had portrayed, and there were actually a lot of good things that they were doing, and forward things, and we actually had a lot of autonomy. But from what I've been hearing, it doesn't sound like there's quite as much autonomy these days, and I think what you can do that's instructive to look at is if you look at a couple of their websites, these days. So let's look at. I'm just doing this off. I haven't looked at these, so this may be not true. There's Delaware Online. The Wilmington, Delaware is a Gannett paper, and then let's see. I can my hometown paper. So you can see they changed the flag in the left-hand side, but the rest of the layout is pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. There's not a lot of distinguishing. I'm trying to think. Burlington, Vermont, I think, is a Gannett paper.
Yeah, I mean, I know the Scripps paper is at least prior to this recent, their spinoff. Theirs were very similar. Same content management system, same layout, very standardized. Very little local control over how the website looked.
Yeah. I mean, even the blue is the same color in the navigation bar for these two. This one at least has the red. And there's a little bit, they've done a little bit of they have some unique content that's specific to theirs. And, you know, honestly, I don't know that that's such a horrible thing, but then I just wonder in terms of if you're trying to inspire innovation in your workforce, if you're just basically giving the same template to every organization, it does that in fact inhibit innovation? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, you know, yeah, there are efficiencies, you know, in standardizing some things, but I mean, if your whole thing is about serving your community and understanding your community, then, you know, it's not a good idea to be kind of imposing these from, you know, some national headquarters that doesn't know anything about, you know, or maybe not anything, but maybe doesn't know as well as, you know, people that actually live there know about their community. So there is some, you know, all of these things are just, you know, rarely black and white, obviously, but.
Well, and that's why I think it's the thing that is tricky on all of this, and this is where is so you want to be innovative, you don't want to settle, and so by doing something like this at the corporate level, you're sending that message to the properties, to the different news organizations. So that's good because you're saying, look, we need to keep pushing the envelope, and here's one way that we can do this. And as long as they give the individual organizations the freedom to decide how to implement this, so that if what we see in the Pensacola, we see some of those beats, you know, that are specific to Pensacola, that maybe in Springfield they'll do something a little different, or in Burlington they'll do something a little bit different, then I'm optimistic that this is a helpful template that can be implemented in different ways.
Right. Yeah, and when I saw that, I was hoping, I mean, I don't know that, but I mean, I was hoping that they were basing those beats on some community conversations, some reader data that they have. I mean, you can't tell that from looking at what Romanesco has there, but that's what I was hoping. I mean, because I think that's the ideal way to, you know, to handle something like that.
Yeah, because ultimately what you have to do is if I'm at the Burlington Free Press, I have to understand, how does my newsroom interact with this community? And how are we seen in this community? And how are we going to engage with this community in a way that we can produce meaningful coverage and that people will want to participate in the coverage, not just as sources, but as participants if they're writing columns or contributing content, or, you know, sharing user-generated content, because that's when we're going to get to this greater level of engagement that we keep talking about.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, any last thoughts before we wrap up the...
I don't think so, but that's, you know, it's just really going to be interesting to watch, because there's such a fine line between sort of a genuine journalism as service, understanding your community, and then kind of a, you know, one in which it's all just kind of corporate speak and you're doing it in kind of a more cynical way. I mean, it just seems like the lines are so thin between those two, and it can be very hard to interpret kind of where you're, you know, I mean, because it's just one thing to say we care about what our community wants, and it's another thing, you know, if you're just kind of imposing that, or you're making that up, or you're using kind of only financial data to make those decisions, because then you really are more pandering than you are actually serving to people. So I think that's really interesting to watch, because it's kind of hard to just tell, you know, by reading about these initiatives, what exactly is going on there and how serious they are about the stuff that they're saying. So,
well, one encouraging takeaway I had here, I'll call it up on the thing. If you look at the memo itself, or in Romanesco's write-up of this, that's very, very encouraging, because one of the Gannett journalists said, you know, here, if you look at this, that they are using Chartbeat and Omniture dashboards to really look at, and hearing a reporter say, metrics is more than clicks, that's encouraging that they are looking at it. They're giving their reporters and their newsrooms the tools they need to understand their audiences and understand what their content is doing.
Right, yeah, and I think at some point in here they also talk about things like impact, which that we've been talking about how that maybe is the ultimate of all metrics. So
right.
If that's something that they're also using beyond just page views, it's going to be a lot more meaningful. So.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Cool.
we will continue this. So you can catch our next episode of the Lean Newsroom. We'll be doing that next. We're going to change the time to Thursdays because that works better with our schedule. What time you want to? 2 o'clock? Should we do 2?
Yeah, 2 sounds good, Chris.
So 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoons, and we should be able to keep that through the rest of the year, so we'll be doing this once a week. It'll probably be a half-an-hour conversation, just talking about some issue related to newsroom change, and we'll just be working through what might be some of the issues related to it, what are some of the pluses and minuses, and how can we apply facets of what we know about innovation, strategy, and culture in making sense of that decision. So we hope you'll join us next week. So thanks for joining us. See you later.